And the next item of business is a debate on motion 20174 in the name of Angela Constance on a motion on legislative consent for the Sentencing Bill UK legislation. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to start by extending my thanks to the Parliament authorities for their cooperation in expediting this work, which will enable the Parliament's position to be communicated to the UK Government before the conclusion of the bill's progress at the House of Lords early in January. I would also like to thank the Justice Committee for their input yesterday, and I look forward to the discussion this afternoon. I am today seeking the Parliament's approval regarding the motion to provide legislative consent to the UK Government's amendments to their current sentencing bill. After ongoing engagement with the UK Government and further engagement with the Scottish Prison Service and the Parole Board for Scotland on the relevant provisions, the Scottish Government recommends that the Parliament agrees to this motion for legislative consent in respect of the UK Government's amendments. The UK Government introduced their sentencing bill on the 2nd of September 2025 to take forward recommendations set out in the Independent Sentencing Review led by the Right Honourable David Gauke, which was published in October 2024. The UK Bill intends to make changes to the sentencing framework and management of offenders in the criminal justice system in England and Wales. This includes making changes to the sentencing of lower-level offences, release provisions for some prisoners, community order requirements and restrictions available for post-prison supervision. The areas of law covered by the Sentencing Bill are largely reserved, or else the provisions extend to England and Wales only. However, on the 14th of November 2025, during the bill's progress, the UK Government tabled amendments which seek to change the sentencing and release arrangements which currently apply to individuals sentenced for a national security offence to match those applied to those individuals sentenced for a terrorism offence. This means that all such prisoners will be considered for parole after serving 2/3 of their sentence, rather than short-term prisoners being subject to automatic release at 40% of their sentence, as they normally would, or long-term prisoners to be considered for parole for the first time at half sentence. As a result of this, several consequential and technical amendments are required to ensure that these provisions could also operate as intended in Scotland. The legislative consent of the Scottish Parliament is required in relation to these amendments, as we consider that the changes being proposed would alter the executive competence of Scottish ministers in relation to their functions concerning the release of prisoners of this type. The changes are expected to have little to no operational impact on the Scottish Prison Service, Parole Board and Justice Social Work Service in Scotland due to the low numbers of prisoners with this sentence type commonly held in Scottish prisons. In fact, SPS have reported that there are currently no such prisoners in the Scottish prison population. However, while the impact may be minimal, I strongly advise the Parliament to consent to these changes. It is sensible to ensure alignment with England and Wales with regard to sentencing of offenders convicted of a national security offence. National security offences are considered on a UK-wide basis, and thus consistency in treatment of those kinds of offenders is important, both with regard to sentencing and release. In fact, non-consent to these amendments may mean that the regime for management of national security offenders in Scotland could be seen as less stringent when compared with the rest of the UK. This would leave Scotland at risk of being seen as a more attractive location for state threat actors and other offenders in the national security category. Thus, the legislative consent of the Scottish Parliament is essential to ensure both this consistency between Scotland and the rest of the UK with regard to the sentencing of national security offences, and that Scotland does not become less stringent in the treatment of these kinds of offences. So in light of these points, I would urge Parliament to support the legislative consent motion. Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary, could I ask you to formally move the motion?
And formally moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call on Liam Kerr to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I rise to speak to this LCM, which was also considered and scrutinised in committee yesterday. As the Cabinet Secretary set out, this issue arises due to the Crime and Policing Bill going through the UK Parliament, which contains provisions in its Clause 8 and Schedule 2, which require the consent of the Scottish Parliament. Now, the Scottish Government has recommended that the Parliament consent to the relevant provisions in the bill and have set out clearly the reasons for that in its LCM detail. I have to say I also found the Cabinet Secretary's evidence highly persuasive, both yesterday and listening just now, particularly around the need to ensure that Scotland is consistent in its treatment of these offenders with the rest of the country. I find it persuasive, the point about that without consent Scotland could be less stringent and be seen as a less rigorous destination for such offenders. So, having given due consideration to the LCM and the representations made both yesterday and today, I find myself in agreement with the Scottish Government's recommendation, and I confirm that the Scottish Conservatives will vote in favour of this LCM at decision time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. And I now call on Pauline McNeill to open on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As you've heard, the UK Government introduced their bill on the 2nd of September, and the bill will make changes to sentencing framework and the management of offenders in England and Wales. So most of that bill applies to England and Wales. But as always in the case, any matters which Westminster deals with that covers criminal law, there is sometimes something to be done here in this Parliament. And as the Cabinet Secretary has said, Scotland cannot be less stringent on matters of national security and matters of counter-terrorism. I've written a speech, Presiding Officer, but I have to say it's pretty much been covered word for word by the Cabinet Secretary. I don't think there's any point in repeating those words because I think it's quite clear. I mean, it is unusual to have a committee deal with the LCM and the very next day be asked to vote on it, but I think the committee were pretty satisfied that there's no controversy in this. I think the essence of it, as you've heard, is that long and short-term prisoners will be treated the same as far as national security is concerned, and they will be released 2/3 of the way into their sentence. So, for the record, Scottish Labour is in favour of this LCM this evening, and there's nothing more to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Angela Constance, to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm grateful to members for their contribution this afternoon. I would like to reiterate the Scottish Government's recommendation that the Parliament should consent to the amendments being tabled for the sentencing bill, not the crime and policing bill, as Mr Kerr referenced at the very start of his remarks. As detailed in my opening statement, these changes will mean that individuals convicted of national security offences will all be considered for release by the Parole Board only after serving 2/3 of their sentence, mirroring the arrangements already in place for terrorist offenders. This approach reflects the seriousness of these crimes and the need for robust and consistent safeguards in managing such offenders across the UK jurisdictions. The immediate practical effects will be limited. The amendments will require only minor technical adjustments in the work of the Parole Board and the Prison Service to ensure the provisions were applied effectively within our system. And as previously mentioned, there are no prisoners currently in our prison system under these national security offences. However, the strategic importance of consent is clear. Failure to consent would create an unnecessary divergence between Scotland and the rest of the UK regarding these offences in future, and applying a less stringent sentencing regime could even make Scotland appear to be a more attractive location for such activity within the UK. And for these reasons, I strongly urge members to support the motion for legislative consent. And so, Presiding Officer, I commend the motion to Parliament, and it just remains for me, Presiding Officer, to wish you a very Merry Christmas and, of course, every single member in this chamber a happy Christmas and a good New Year. And we all, of course, want to pay tribute to our very hard-working staff in this Parliament and also those who support us in our offices up and down the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate on a motion on legislative consent for the Sentencing Bill UK legislation. There will be a very short pause before we move on to the next item of business.
I'm minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 11.2.4 of Standing Orders that decision time be brought forward to now. And I invite the Minister for Parliamentary Business to move the motion.
Move with pleasure, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question is that decision time be brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? We are agreed, and there are two questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first is that motion 20173 in the name of Siobhan Brown on the Contract, Formation and Remedies Scotland Bill at stage 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The final question is that motion 20174 in the name of Angela Constance on a motion on legislative consent for the Sentencing Bill UK legislation be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. And before we move on to members' business, may I just wish all members a very happy and peaceful Christmas, and may I extend good wishes on behalf of all members to all staff in the Parliament who support us throughout the year. Thank you. And we'll now move on to members' business in the name of Alistair Allen.